The morning Sarah Mitchell received the text, she was elbow-deep in horse feed, her shirt already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. The ranch sprawled across 247 acres of Northern California landscape, rolling hills, oak groves, and a creek that ran clear and cold year-round. It was beautiful, demanding, and exclusively hers. No partners, no ex-husband claiming stake. Just Sarah, her 80 head of Hereford cattle, 3 horses, and the life she'd rebuilt from nothing. The text came from Corinne Henderson, her neighbor 3 miles down the road. "Hey, gorgeous, throwing an epic pool party this Saturday. Tell me you're coming. Bringing my whole squad, fire." Sarah almost laughed. She and Corinne had exchanged pleasantries exactly twice, once at the co-op, once at the veterinary clinic. Corinne was the type of woman who made everything into an event, designer everything, a Range Rover that never saw actual dirt. Sarah had heard through the grapevine that Corinne's husband had left her 18 months ago, remarried a woman 10 years younger. Community gossip mill, the usual cruelty wrapped in concern. She typed back, "Thanks for the invite, but I've got ranch work. Enjoy, though." The response came within 30 seconds. "Come on, you can't work 24/7. You need to live. I'm having catering, a DJ, 3 cases of Prosecco. Pool's heated to 82 degrees. Literally the party of the season. Bring friends or come solo. More fun that way. Saturday 2 p.m. BORING." Sarah set the phone down. She had cattle to vaccinate, a fence on the north pasture that needed reinforcing, and a water pump that was starting to make a sound like a dying whale. She definitely didn't need Corinne Henderson's pool party. But something in the persistence of that text bothered her. Not enough to say yes. Just enough to make her feel momentarily bad about the refusal. Her best friend Diane called while she was fixing sandwiches for lunch. "Are you going to Corinne Henderson's thing?" Diane asked without preamble. "How do you know about it?" "Sarah, she's invited literally everyone on this side of the county. She's posted about it on Instagram like 40 times. I'm going, you should come, could be fun, could be a disaster. Either way, entertainment." "I can't, too much work." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." "Okay, but you're literally lonely. You know that, right? You're out there on that ranch like you're hiding from civilization." Sarah took a bite of her sandwich. It was cold, everything felt cold. "I'm not hiding, I'm working." "Those aren't mutually exclusive, babe." Diane had been her friend since they were 16, which meant she could say things to Sarah that nobody else could. "Come for an hour, 1 hour. Show up, have a drink, leave. Prove you're still human." After they hung up, Sarah stood at her kitchen window looking out at the eastern pasture. The cattle were scattered across the grass, peaceful and mindless. She had built something real here, something that mattered. A pool party with Corinne Henderson felt like a step backward into a world of surface and vanity. She didn't go. Sarah woke up Saturday morning to chaos. It started around noon with vehicles. She was in the north pasture fixing fence posts when she heard the first diesel rumble on the road, the kind of volume that carries for miles. Then another. Then music, not quietly playing, blasting. Bass so heavy it made the ground feel different beneath her boots. She looked toward the Henderson property. You couldn't see the house from her ranch. That was part of the appeal of living out here. But you could sure as hell hear it now. Sarah worked through it. The cattle, spooked by the noise, kept breaking their pattern, moving restlessly. She'd have preferred to finish the fence today, but stress from the animals meant she'd lose them to poor feeding behaviors tomorrow, and that would put her further behind schedule. She decided to pull back, move them to the western pasture where the trees would buffer some of the sound. By 3 o'clock, the music had gotten louder. She recognized the lyrics. Whatever chart topper was popular this season, the kind of thing they played at clubs. The kind of music she hadn't heard live in years. It made her feel ancient at 42. She went inside for water and nearly jumped out of her skin. There was a woman standing at the edge of her property, right where the fence line was, taking a selfie. Late 20s bikini, completely unaware that she was trespassing. Behind her, you could see the edge of Corinne's property, but not by much. Sarah walked down to her in long strides. "This is private property," she said. The woman turned, startled. "Oh my God, sorry, I'm just getting content. This view is insane." She gestured vaguely at the landscape behind Sarah. "Corinne said we could walk around the property." "Corinne doesn't own my property." "Right, yeah, sorry." The woman didn't actually look sorry. She looked like she was calculating the angles. "Corinne said her neighbor was cool about stuff." "Corinne was wrong." The woman took a few steps back. Okay, okay, I'm going. No drama. But she was still holding her phone up, still recording, still treating the entire situation like it was background scenery for her personal brand. Sarah watched her disappear back toward Corinne's place, then went inside and locked the doors. She told herself it was just precaution. She told herself it wouldn't escalate. By 4 o'clock, the first actual trespasser came looking for the bathroom. A young man, maybe 18, very drunk, very apologetic when Sarah found him in her back hallway. "The bathroom line is crazy," he said, "and I really gotta go, and I thought." "Thought what? That you'd wander onto someone else's property." "Is this not Corinne's?" "No." "Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." She pointed him back toward the road. He stumbled away, leaving a smell like spilled beer and bad decisions in her hallway. Sarah considered driving over to Corinne's place and having words. The reasonable adult part of her said this was a neighbor dispute that needed handling. The exhausted, frustrated part of her said that confronting Corinne would only make this worse. Corinne would apologize with that practiced smile, promise to keep the guests contained, and then 30 minutes later, another teenager would be pissing off her back porch. Instead, Sarah went back outside and did what she could to keep her cattle calm. She moved them farther west where the trees were thicker. The Herefords were solid stock, good mothers, predictable temperament, but they weren't stupid. The noise, the unusual activity, the rhythmic bass that seemed to exist at a frequency only animals could fully process. It all accumulated into a low-level panic that expressed itself in restlessness. By 6 o'clock, the music had evolved. Someone had moved the DJ setup closer to the property line. Sarah could now hear not just the bass but actual vocals, people singing or shouting along. She could see lights beginning to strobe in the gathering dusk, colors reflecting against Corinne's barn. She called the non-emergency sheriff's line. "I've got a neighbor with a party," she explained to the dispatcher. "Music's quite loud and I'm concerned about the noise ordinance." "You filed a complaint." "That's what I'm doing." "Ma'am, we have limited availability tonight. If the party ends at a reasonable hour, we probably won't send anyone out. You could try speaking with your neighbor." Sarah thanked her and hung up, knowing how this would end. The party would continue until whenever the guests lost interest. The sheriff wouldn't come unless someone was literally on fire, and she would spend the evening managing spooked cattle and her own frustration. She fed her animals extra early, made sure they had water, and checked the fence line one more time. Everything was secure. The cattle were bunched together in the western pasture, calm enough in the shade of the oaks. At 7:30, Corinne called. "Hey, you changed your mind and came." "No," Sarah said. "I'm calling about the noise and the trespassing." There was a pause. Sarah could hear the music clearly over the phone. "Oh my God, it's not that loud. Your guests are wandering onto my property. They're just looking around. This is the country, Sarah. It's supposed to be fun and loose." "Not on my land." Corinne's tone shifted. The bright, performative friendliness drained away, replaced with something harder. "You know what? I get it. You're upset because I didn't invite you or whatever, and now you're being difficult. You did invite me, I declined. And now you're being dramatic about a little noise." Sarah hung up. She shouldn't have hung up. That would make things worse. But she'd reached her limit for the day, and listening to Corinne explain the concept of fun and looseness wasn't in her capacity right now. At 8:15, two college-age guys came through her fence looking for a shortcut to the main road. At 8:40, a group of girls decided her driveway was the perfect spot for a pre-game Instagram video. At 9, someone drove past her house slowly, probably looking for parking. Sarah sat on her porch with a bourbon and watched the chaos unfold at a distance. The sky had gone full dark now, and Corinne's property was lit up like a festival. She could see silhouettes moving across the lit pool, could hear splashing and screams and laughter. The music had reached that point where it was less music and more pure sonic assault. She checked her cattle one more time at 9:30. They were still okay, but the collective anxiety was building. The young bulls were getting worked up and the mothers were on edge. It was a situation with a limited number of positive outcomes. Sarah went inside and set her phone alarm for 5 a.m. She had an early vet appointment with the South herd regardless. The night would be long, the morning would come too fast, and the cows would still need care. She was in bed by 10, noise-canceling earplugs in, trying not to think about tomorrow. She made it until 11:47 p.m. The sound that woke her wasn't the music. The music had finally stopped around 11, which meant the alarm was a genuine physical sound, not just background noise she'd learned to sleep through. A crash loud enough to cut through earplugs and the closed window and her attempted sleep. Then another. Sarah was out of bed and reaching for her robe without thinking through what she was actually going to do. The sounds were coming from the direction of her main pasture, the one that bordered Corinne's property. She grabbed the heavy flashlight she kept by the back door and went outside, her heart already running fast enough that she could feel it in her neck. What she found stopped her cold. The fence line on the east side of her property, the part that bordered Corinne's, was down, not partially down, not sagging, completely utterly destroyed. Fence posts snapped like toothpicks, wire tangled and broken, and through the gap. A man in his early 60s, holding a beer, staring at what he'd clearly just driven a car through. Sarah's voice came out flat. "What the hell did you do?" He turned to her, squinting. The fence was right there and I was trying to..." He gestured vaguely with his beer and Sarah realized he was extremely drunk. "Where's the hot tub? Corinne said there was a hot tub." She didn't answer him. She looked past him toward her pasture, toward where the cattle should have been, toward the gap in the fence and the disaster that was about to unfold. "Where are my cows?" she asked, though she already knew. She'd moved them to the western pasture earlier, but he had just created a pathway. A direct line between Corinne's property, where approximately 70 drunk people were partying, and anywhere else they could run. "What?" "My cattle," Sarah said quietly, and then she was moving, heading toward the western fence line because she could hear them now. A sound like distant thunder. A sound like hooves on hard earth. A sound like something large and frightened and moving with momentum. She understood in that moment with absolute clarity that her night was about to become much, much worse. The western pasture erupted as Sarah reached the fence. In the glow of her flashlight and the ambient light spilling from Corinne's property, she could see them, all 80 head, moving as one organism, spooked by something she couldn't immediately identify. The cattle were experienced with the land, trained to stay in their designated areas, but something had triggered a panic response that overrode their normal behavior. Sarah moved toward the fence line, scanning for the breach, and there, the gate. The main access gate between her western pasture and the road that led to Corinne's property. It was wide open. She didn't remember leaving it open. She was absolutely certain she'd closed it after moving the cattle just that afternoon. The herd was starting to move toward the opening, not running yet but walking with purpose. The panic was starting to coalesce into movement. Sarah could see the big bulls at the front, their massive frames silhouetted against the strobing light from Corinne's property. The younger cattle followed, and behind them the mothers with their calves, trying to keep them corralled but losing the fight. "No, no, no," Sarah muttered, running toward the gate. If she could close it before they reached it, she could contain them. If she could get ahead of the herd before they committed fully to the escape route, she could redirect them back toward the open pasture. But she was a 42-year-old woman in bare feet and a robe, carrying a flashlight. The cattle weighed over 1,000 pounds each and were moving with the kind of unified panic that made them unpredictable and dangerous. Sarah reached the gate and grabbed the handle, pulling hard. The metal was cold and resistant. It didn't close the way it should. The hinges, something was wrong with the hinges. The cattle were 50 yards away now. She could hear them, smell the dust they were kicking up. The lead bulls were moving faster, sensing the opening. "Come on," Sarah gasped, pulling the gate with everything she had. It swung maybe a quarter of the way closed before stopping with a grinding, metal-on-metal crunch. The hinges were bent, deliberately bent by the look of them. The lead bull reached the gate without breaking stride, his massive shoulders hitting the partially closed metal and shouldering it open. It swung back on its damaged hinges, and then the herd was flowing through like water through a broken dam. Sarah jumped out of the way, her flashlight spinning across the darkness as she stumbled backward. She could feel the vibration of 80 cattle moving at speed through the ground beneath her feet, could hear the bellow of the lead bull, could smell the primal panic sweat of a large herd in full crisis mode. Then they were past her, pouring through the gate and onto the road that led directly to Corinne's property. Sarah's first instinct was to run for her truck. Her second instinct was to call the sheriff. Her third instinct, The one that actually won was to run after the herd and try to contain what was about to happen. She was halfway to her truck, in the process of waving goodbye to her rational mind, when the sound hit Corinne's property like a living thing. It started with the music cutting off abruptly, then screaming, not the playful, drunk screaming of a party, actual screams of terror and confusion. Sarah heard the splash first, the lead bull crashing directly into the pool. Then the second splash and the third, and the sound of the metal frame beneath the inflatable pool crumpling like it was made of paper. People scrambled out of the way, running in all directions, and Sarah could see the cattle beginning to spread out across Corinne's property, completely panicked now, completely unleashed. There were around 40 guests still in the pool area, more inside the house, and now there were 80 head of large, terrified livestock charging through their carefully manicured disaster. Sarah reached her truck and started the engine, taking a moment to grab a rope and 2 emergency flashlights before heading toward Corinne's property. She had no plan. None. She just knew she needed to be there, needed to try to minimize the damage, needed to bear witness to what her life had just become. As she pulled onto Corinne's property, bypassing the still-open front gate, the scene resolved itself into something that almost didn't seem real. Her cattle were everywhere. One had crashed through a glass patio door and was currently inside Corinne's house. She could see its dark shadow moving past illuminated windows, the sound of breaking things following in its wake. Another had trampled directly through the catering table. Another had tangled in the string lights that had been decorating the poolside, bringing down an entire section of the decorations and, inexplicably, the DJ booth. The DJ, a tall, thin man with elaborate hair, was standing in the middle of this chaos holding his equipment and crying. Corinne emerged from the house, screaming incoherently at nobody and everybody. "What is happening? What is happening?" Sarah pulled up and jumped out of the truck. She had a rope in hand, and she immediately started moving toward the cattle that seemed most agitated, making herself a target and a focal point, trying to redirect their panic away from the guests who were still scattered around the property. "Back, back," she called, snapping the rope, making herself big and loud. The cattle, conditioned to respond to her voice, began to turn their attention toward her. Not all of them. Some were too panicked, too lost in their fear, but enough. The lead bull, the massive Hereford who'd initiated the escape, turned and looked at her with wild eyes. She recognized the moment when his panic shifted into a different kind of response. The moment when the herd's collective mind began to reorganize itself around her presence instead of the chaos of Corinne's property. "Come on, boy," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fact that her hands were shaking. "Come on, let's go home." She started moving backward toward the gate, toward the road, rope in hand. The lead bull followed her, his massive bulk making the ground shake with each step. And behind him, the others began to follow, the instinct of the herd reorganizing itself now that there was a focal point. It took 20 minutes to get them back through the gate. 20 minutes of herding 80 panicked cattle through Corinne's ruined property, past the shell-shocked guests, past the destroyed pool and the devastated catering area. One of the younger bulls tried to break off and investigate the interior of Corinne's house more thoroughly, but Sarah was able to cut him off and redirect him back toward the main group. When the last of them had gone through the gate, she ran back and began to close it. It closed easier this time, the bent hinges somehow engaging in a configuration that held. She made a mental note to check the fence hinges more thoroughly in the morning to look for signs of deliberate damage. Then she walked back toward the property, toward Corinne and the wreckage, knowing that this was when the real consequences would begin. Corinne was sitting on the edge of what used to be her decorative fire pit, her face streaked with tears and mascara, looking like a movie villain who'd been exposed. Around her, guests were examining damage. The pool was completely destroyed, all the water drained out now, the frame bent and useless. The catering area was scattered across the patio. The string lights were down. The DJ booth had been trampled. And somewhere inside the house, there was still the sound of breaking things as one of the cattle navigated the interior, completely panicked. "There's a cow in my kitchen," Corinne said to Sarah, her voice hollow. "There's an actual cow in my kitchen. What the hell? What the actual hell?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was taking in the scale of the damage, understanding with cold clarity that this was the moment her life fundamentally changed. Insurance claims, liability, the question of how the cattle had gotten loose in the first place. The question that led directly to the bent hinges. My cattle got out, Sarah said carefully, through a gate that appears to have been deliberately damaged. Corinne's head snapped up. What? That's not, I didn't. She gestured wildly at the destruction around them. How is that my fault? Your guests, Sarah said quietly. Someone in your party went through my fence line and damaged my property, multiple pieces of my property. Oh, so this is my fault. These are your wild animals, and it's somehow my fault that they're here destroying my home. They're not wild, Sarah said. They're livestock, and yes, actually this is directly your fault, or the fault of whoever you invited who decided to drive through my fence, and someone opened my gates, deliberately. Corinne stood up. Her face was red now, her voice rising. You know what? I don't care. I don't care about your gates or your fence or your stupid cows. You could have come to my party. You could have been a normal human being for one night. But instead, you decided to be a miserable hermit bitch, and now look what's happened. This is because of you. All of this is because of you. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She became aware of the other guests watching this interaction, awareness beginning to dawn on their faces that they were witnessing something beyond the scope of a ruined party. I'm going to need to call the sheriff, Sarah said finally. And I'm going to need your guest list. The cattle did significant damage to your property, and you did damage to mine. We need to identify who caused this. I'm not giving you anything, Corinne said. I'm calling my lawyer, and I'm filing a claim against your ranch for the damage your animals caused. Sarah almost laughed. The animals that were let loose onto your property by your guests. The animals that you couldn't control. The animals that you knew were dangerous, apparently, because you mentioned spoking them with the noise. The animals that you didn't secure properly. It was the kind of argument that would echo through the next 6 months. The kind of dispute that would require insurance companies and lawyers and depositions. But standing there in that moment, with Corinne's face twisted with anger and the smell of cattle and destruction in the air, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had done nothing wrong. She had built something real and good. And Corinne Henderson, who couldn't be bothered to understand basic boundaries or property rights, had brought this destruction down on both their lives out of pure malice. I'll be filing a report with the sheriff, Sarah said, and my insurance company will be contacting you. Don't leave the area. She turned and walked back toward her truck, leaving Corinne standing in the wreckage of her party, surrounded by shell-shocked guests and the evidence of her own catastrophic miscalculation. Behind her, she could hear Corinne screaming something, but Sarah didn't turn around. She had cattle to check, a fence line to survey, and somewhere in that dark night, the understanding that her quiet life was about to become very public. The sheriff arrived at 12:47 a.m. By that time, Sarah had confirmed that all 80 head were accounted for and mostly calmed down, clustered in the western pasture with the gate now properly secured. The lead bull had a small cut on his shoulder but was otherwise fine. The younger cattle were traumatized but unharmed. The deputies, when they finally showed up, took statements from both Sarah and Corinne in separate locations. The bent hinges on the gate became the focal point. The destroyed fence posts. The open gate between pastures. The damaged car that was still sitting in the middle of Sarah's property, a BMW with a bent bumper and what looked like cattle hair caught in the grill. Can we tow it? Sarah asked the deputy. Once we get the owner to come claim it or we get a proper order, the deputy said, writing in his notebook. We can process it as evidence of the original trespass. By 2 in the morning, Sarah was standing in her kitchen with a cup of tea she'd made and forgotten to drink, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened. The cattle had cost her. Corinne's property had been damaged, and Corinne would absolutely sue. But beyond the immediate financial consequences, Sarah was beginning to understand the nature of what she was facing. This wasn't going to be solved quickly. This wasn't going to be resolved between neighbors. Corinne was angry, embarrassed, and backed into a corner. She would escalate. That was what people like Corinne did when they were confronted with the consequences of their own choices. They escalated, weaponized, hired lawyers, and made everything worse. Sarah had known from the moment Corinne's first text came through that this could only end one of 2 ways. Sarah would have to attend the party, swallow her discomfort, and sacrifice her time and energy to Corinne's social needs. Or she wouldn't, and Corinne would hold it against her. She'd chosen to hold her boundary, and now she was going to pay the price. At 3 in the morning, Sarah gave up on sleep. She went outside with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, and she began to document everything. She photographed the bent hinges. She photographed the footprints in her pasture, muddy, clear, leading from Corinne's property toward where the gate had been. She photographed the damage to her fence posts. She photographed the tire tracks in her driveway where the BMW had been parked. By the time the sun came up, she had over 200 photographs and a growing understanding that the real disaster had nothing to do with the cattle at all. The morning news arrived at 6:15 a.m. in the form of a reporter from the local television station. Apparently, one of Corinne's guests had posted videos to social media, multiple angles of cattle stamping through a luxury home, destroying a pool, scattering expensive catering across landscaped grounds. By the time the sun was fully up, it had gone viral in regional circles. The incident had a hashtag, Pool Party Stampede. Sarah learned about this from Diane, who called while Sarah was making breakfast she wouldn't be able to eat. "It's everywhere," Diane said, breathing hard like she'd run a distance to call. "Sarah, you're internet famous. Your cattle have a Twitter account right now. Someone started one called the Hereford Avengers. There are memes." "I don't care about memes." "You should care about this," Diane said. "There are already people defending you, lots of people. The internet thinks Corinne is an idiot, which fair, but that doesn't help you with the legal stuff." The legal stuff arrived at 7:30 in the form of an email from a law firm Sarah had never heard of. Corinne had already filed a claim for property damage. The email listed the alleged damages in excruciating detail. Destroyed in-ground pool, $18,000. Destroyed patio furniture, $4,200. Destroyed catering, $2,300. Damaged landscaping, $5,600. Destroyed sound equipment, $3,100. Damaged windows and doors, $8,900. Damaged interior finishes, $12,000, and emotional distress. The total came to just over $54,000. They were requesting settlement within 30 days. Sarah forwarded the email to her insurance company and called her own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in agricultural and ranch disputes. Patricia's first words were not reassuring. "We need to talk about liability," Patricia said. "The question of how your cattle got loose is crucial. Can you prove they were deliberately released?" "The hinges on my gate are bent," Sarah said. "Not naturally bent. Someone did this on purpose." "Who? Do you have proof of who?" "The sheriff is investigating. Someone at the party drove through my fence, a BMW." "Do we know who was driving it?" "Not yet." Patricia sighed. "Okay, so here's what we're facing. Corinne's legal team is going to argue that you failed to maintain adequate fencing and gate systems to contain your livestock. They're going to argue that a responsible property owner would have had redundant security measures. They're going to argue that you knew the party was happening, knew the noise might spook the cattle, and failed to take adequate precautions." "That's insane." "It's strategy, and it's not entirely unreasonable from a legal perspective. Property owners do have a responsibility to contain their livestock." Patricia paused. "The question becomes whether her guests deliberately damaged your property to release the cattle, or whether your infrastructure was simply inadequate. If it's the former, we have a strong defense and a countersuit. If it's the latter, we're liable." Sarah hung up the phone feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She was going to have to prove malice. She was going to have to establish intent. "The sheriff called at 9 o'clock. We identified the BMW owner," the deputy said. She sounded tired. "A gentleman named Robert Kelso, age 63. He claims he was trying to find the bathroom and wasn't paying attention to where he was driving. He's admitted to hitting your fence, but he's saying it was an accident." "My gate hinges are bent," Sarah said. "He says he doesn't remember that. Says he was intoxicated and that the whole incident is fuzzy." "What about the gate? It was deliberately opened." "Can't prove who opened it. Could have been any of 70-plus people." After the deputy hung up, Sarah sat in her kitchen and understood the full scope of what she was facing. Corinne had given her a party full of drunk people and then claimed ignorance. Her guests had done the actual damage, and now they could hide behind inebriation and anonymity. The legal burden was on Sarah to prove intent, and proving intent was nearly impossible when you were dealing with 70 inebriated party guests. At 10 o'clock, her phone started ringing continuously. It was reporters. The story had become newsworthy beyond the internet. It had the components of a great news cycle: rural woman versus entitled city neighbor, property damage, livestock drama, the question of responsibility and liability. Sarah didn't answer any of them. She just let them ring, watching the numbers accumulate on her screen, understanding that her privacy was about to become a commodity. By noon, there were news vans at the end of her driveway. By 1 o'clock, someone had thrown a brick through her mailbox. Not a thrown brick, a brick with a note attached. The note said, "Karen for President, you suck." By 2 o'clock, Diane had arrived with groceries and a grim expression. "It's getting weird out there," Diane said, setting bags on the counter. "Social media is weird. Half the people are on your side, calling Karen a spoiled narcissist. The other half are saying you're a bitter, jealous woman who hurt innocent people. Someone started a GoFundMe for Karen." "How much did it raise?" $14,000 so far. Sarah put her face in her hands. "The good news," Diane continued, "is that the local community is mostly on your side. I've heard people at the grocery store talking about this. The general consensus is that Karen is an asshole and got what was coming to her." "That doesn't matter legally." "No," Diane agreed. "But it matters psychologically, and it's going to matter when this goes to trial if it goes to trial. A jury is going to consist of local people who know what Karen is like." Sarah looked at her friend. "Does everyone know what she's like?" "Of course. You're just the first person she's pushed hard enough that something actually broke." The actual confrontation happened on Thursday, 4 days after the party. Sarah had been staying low, doing ranch work, avoiding the media, when she saw Karen's Range Rover pull up her driveway. Sarah was in the south pasture checking on a calf that had been born the day after the stampede. The mother was protective but healthy, and the calf was strong. She saw the car arrive and took her time walking back toward the house, knowing that Karen would either wait or leave, and either way, Sarah wasn't going to rush. Karen was leaning against her car when Sarah finally reached her, dressed in designer workout clothes that looked like they'd never actually been used for working out. Her face was carefully made up, her hair was perfectly styled, and she was radiating anger that looked like it had been refined and concentrated over the past 4 days. "Hi," Karen said, her voice tight. "We need to talk." "Our lawyers can talk," Sarah said. "That's why we have lawyers." "I don't want to talk to you through lawyers. I want to talk to you woman to woman." Sarah stopped a few feet away. "Okay, talk." Karen took a breath. "I know you don't like me. I know you think I'm shallow and selfish and whatever other judgments you've made about me since we moved here. But what you did to me was cruel. You knew the party was happening. You could have just not been a bitch about it. You could have just let me have one night. One night of feeling like my life was something other than a pile of ashes because my husband left me." Sarah said nothing. She waited. "That brick was from someone in the community," Karen continued. "Do you know that? I've found 13 of them. 13 people have thrown bricks through my windows or left them on my property with notes. I had to hire a security company. I've been getting death threats online. Death threats, Sarah. Actual messages telling me I deserve to die." "That's not my fault." "It's exactly your fault. You made this into a thing. You called the police. You gave statements to reporters. You turned your cattle stampede into a public spectacle and made me the villain." "The reporters came to me. I didn't call them." "You didn't have to," Karen's voice was rising. "You just had to shut up. You just had to not talk about how I was irresponsible or how my guests damaged your property. You could have kept it quiet, handled it between neighbors, but instead you've made me into a joke. A national joke. Do you know what it's like to have your home destroyed and then have the world laugh at you about it?" Sarah understood in that moment that Karen genuinely couldn't see her own responsibility in any of this. She couldn't see the party, couldn't see the noise, couldn't see the boundary violation. All she could see was herself, hurt and exposed and the center of unwanted attention. "You invited me," Sarah said quietly. "I said no. You treated that as a personal rejection. You invited 70 strangers onto property adjacent to mine. They damaged my fence. They released my livestock. Your pool got destroyed. These are consequences." "So that's a yes. You're saying this is deserved." "I'm saying that you created the conditions for this to happen." Karen's face went very still. "You know what? Forget it. Forget trying to appeal to your humanity. I wanted to see if we could resolve this woman to woman, but clearly you don't have any humanity to appeal to. My lawyer will be in touch." She drove away, spraying gravel, and Sarah stood in her driveway feeling something she hadn't anticipated. A strange, hollow kind of guilt. Not guilt over the cattle, not guilt over what had happened, but guilt over the recognition that Karen was in genuine pain and that Sarah's refusal to engage had contributed to the escalation. That night, Sarah called Patricia. "What are the settlement numbers looking like?" she asked. "They've reduced the claim to 38,000, Patricia said. "But that's based on her refusing to provide evidence that the damage your cattle caused was actually as extensive as she claims. We could countersue for the fence damage, the gate damage, and your veterinary costs for the cattle stress. I'd estimate we could claim around 8,000. So if we go to trial, even if we win, we're looking at a net loss. Possibly, depends on how the court values the emotional distress argument, depends on evidence, depends on a lot of factors. But yes, litigation is expensive, and even if we win, we might not come out ahead." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. What if I just paid her? Paid her the full amount? What if I offered her something reasonable and we just ended it? Patricia's voice shifted. "You don't have to do that, we have a strong case." "I don't think we do," Sarah said. "I think we have a complicated case where the evidence of deliberate release is murky, where Karen's legal team is going to argue negligence, and where I'm going to end up spending $40,000 and 6 months of my life proving that I did nothing wrong." "So what? You just let her sue you into submission?" "No, but I'm 42 years old. I've rebuilt my life once already. I don't want to rebuild it again. If settling for 20,000 means I get my quiet life back." 20,000, she won't accept 20. "Maybe she will. Maybe she's as tired of this as I am." Patricia was doubtful, but she said she'd reach out to Karen's legal team with a settlement offer. Karen rejected the first offer. She rejected the second. At the third offer, 28,000, there was movement. A counteroffer came back at 32,000, and Sarah understood that this was the universe telling her what the price of her boundary was. She authorized the settlement. The paperwork took 2 weeks to process, but by the end of September, it was done. Sarah's insurance company paid Karen most of it, and Sarah paid the deductible out of her own account. She signed a document agreeing not to discuss the incident publicly, not to encourage others to discuss it, and not to make any statements that could be construed as disparaging to Karen. The silence clause, the thing that would let Karen claim victory and let Sarah fade away. Within 3 days, Karen had posted on Instagram, "So grateful to have reached a settlement with my neighbor regarding the recent incident. I'm choosing to move forward with grace and healing. Thank you all for your support during a difficult time." The comments were full of people telling her how strong she was, how she'd handled it so well, how her neighbor must have been clearly at fault if they'd had to pay her. October arrived with the particular kind of clarity that comes after you've paid someone for the privilege of being wronged. Sarah moved through her days with a quiet efficiency that bordered on mechanical. The cattle were fine. The fence was repaired. The gate hinges were replaced with something stronger. Life continued in its necessary rhythms, and Sarah tried very hard not to think about how much she'd paid to keep that life intact. Diane came by every few days, bringing groceries or just sitting in Sarah's kitchen with a cup of coffee, trying to draw her out of what Diane called her revenge spiral. "You're not spiraling," Diane said one day when Sarah had been quiet for longer than Diane's comfort level allowed. "You're just sad." "I'm not sad." "You are, though. You're sad because you got screwed and then you paid someone to make it stop, and now you feel like you betrayed yourself." Sarah didn't argue. Diane was right, but being right didn't make it easier. The news cycle moved on. Other stories took precedence. The #pool party stampede faded from the internet, replaced by celebrity scandals and political theater and the endless churn of content that demanded constant refresh. By October 15th, Sarah could go back into town without being recognized. By November 1st, the reporters had entirely forgotten about her. But the community hadn't. She started noticing it in small ways. At the feed store, people who had previously been friendly became slightly too sympathetic. They'd ask how she was doing with an emphasis that made it clear they'd seen the internet coverage. At the veterinary clinic, a woman started asking pointed questions about the incident that made it clear she'd taken sides with Karen. What Sarah hadn't anticipated was that a portion of the local community would use her settlement as proof of guilt. If she didn't do anything wrong, why would she pay? Sarah overheard at the co-op. Insurance probably made her, someone else replied. Insurance or guilt, the first woman said knowingly. There was a kind of narrative that emerged, unspoken but pervasive. Sarah had been reckless. Karen had been entitled but innocent of deliberate wrongdoing. Sarah's cattle had damaged Karen's property, and Sarah had chosen, correctly, to accept financial responsibility rather than drag everyone through a lawsuit. The resolution was just, and Sarah was correctly humiliated by the outcome. It was a narrative that was almost true, which made it devastatingly effective. In mid-October, someone left a dead calf on Sarah's property line. It was one of her own, stillborn 2 months earlier, that she'd already buried in the pasture cemetery where she interred her animals with respect. The carcass was partially decomposed, clearly exhumed. Someone had dug it up and left it as a statement. Sarah called the sheriff. "That's definitely malicious," the deputy said, examining the remains. "But we can't prove who did it. Could be anyone who wanted to upset you." "And what exactly do I do about that?" "Document it. Install security cameras if you haven't already. This could escalate, especially with the tension from the settlement and the online attention." Sarah bought 4 security cameras and had them professionally installed, pointing at the main house, the barn, the fence line nearest to Karen's property, and the driveway. The total cost was $2,100. She charged it to the same credit card she'd used to pay for the settlement. 2 days later, her mailbox was destroyed. Not knocked over, completely obliterated. It looked like it had been hit with a sledgehammer or a truck. There was no note. There was just the message, "Your property is not safe." Sarah called the sheriff again. The deputy who came out was different from before, older, someone who seemed familiar with the dynamics of rural property disputes. "You have cameras?" he asked, looking at the destroyed mailbox. "Yes, I'll download the footage." They went inside together. Sarah pulled up the footage from the previous night and they watched as a truck, impossible to identify from the angle, too dark, too far away, pulled up to the mailbox, and what looked like someone in the truck bed used a sledgehammer to destroy it. "Can't see plates," the deputy said. "Can't see faces, could be anyone." "It's Karen," Sarah said. "You don't know that." "I know she's been getting online support, that people think I'm guilty, and that someone's trying to drive me off my own property." The deputy shifted his weight. "Look, I understand you're frustrated, but we can't just assume it's her because we think she's guilty. We need evidence, and this footage doesn't provide that." He filed a report. He also, Sarah noticed, didn't hide his skepticism about whether anything would actually come of it. November brought rain and a kind of resignation that Sarah recognized as something approaching acceptance. She wasn't fine with what had happened. She wasn't over it. But she was beginning to understand that this was the new reality of her life. She would be the woman who got sued by her neighbor. She would be the woman who paid a settlement. She would be the woman on the wrong side of a story that everyone in the community understood differently than she did. Diane invited her to Thanksgiving at her house, and Sarah almost declined out of habit before forcing herself to accept. She spent the morning of Thanksgiving with her cattle, making sure they had water and feed, taking care of the daily tasks that never stopped regardless of the day. Then she drove to Diane's place, bringing a pie she'd baked the night before, ready to sit at a table with people who knew her and still wanted her there. Diane's house was full. There was Diane's ex-husband. They'd divorced but remained friendly. There were Diane's 2 adult kids and their partners. There was Diane's sister from Sacramento. There was Marcus, who owned the neighboring ranch and came to most of Diane's events. And there was James. James was a lawyer. Sarah knew this within 5 minutes of being introduced because it was the first thing Diane mentioned. "This is James. He's a lawyer. I told him about your situation." Sarah shot Diane a look that should have killed her on the spot. "I thought he might have useful information," Diane said innocently, already moving on to something else. James was in his mid-40s, attractive in a rumpled way that suggested he spent more time reading case law than worrying about his appearance. He held Sarah's gaze for a moment longer than necessary when they shook hands. "I'm not going to give you unsolicited legal advice," he said, despite what Diane clearly just asked me to do. Sarah appreciated that. "Thank you. But if you wanted to discuss things later, I'm happy to listen." "There's nothing to discuss. It's settled." "Is it?" James asked. "Legally, maybe, but you don't look like it's settled to me." Sarah turned away and helped Diane in the kitchen, but she was aware of James throughout the afternoon. He was easy in a way that suggested someone who'd made peace with himself. He didn't try too hard to be charming. He listened more than he talked, and somehow, by dessert, he'd drawn Sarah into a conversation about ranching and cattle and the specific mathematics of managing a property where every animal had a cost and every decision had financial consequences. "It sounds lonely," he said when she finished explaining the basics of her operation. "It's not supposed to be lonely. It's supposed to be independent. Those aren't mutually exclusive." After Thanksgiving, James called. Diane gave him her number, which Sarah would have words with Diane about if she cared enough to have words about anything anymore. "Coffee?" he asked. "No pressure, just coffee." Sarah said yes, which surprised her. They met at a cafe in the next town over, somewhere far enough away that they wouldn't be seen by anyone who might feel the need to report back to Karen or to the community at large. "Diane told me what happened," James said when they were seated with coffee. "Not the internet version, the actual version." "Did she?" "She did, and I want you to know that you got screwed." "I know that. But more importantly, you screwed yourself by paying the settlement." Sarah set down her coffee. "You sound like my lawyer." "I'm a lawyer, yeah, but I'm also someone who's watched enough small-town disputes to know that paying someone who wronged you only makes them feel vindicated. It makes them feel like they won." "They did win." "No," James said. "You won, you got your life back, they got money. But they also got proof that if they pushed you hard enough, you'd back down. That's not a win for them. That's a setup for them doing it again." Sarah didn't want to think about it doing it again. She wanted to think that paying Karen had closed that chapter, that Sarah could go back to being invisible and quiet and undisturbed. "The cameras were a good idea," James said. "Do you have someone checking them regularly?" "Just me." "You should get someone else to do it, someone who's not emotionally invested. If something else happens, the footage means more if it's documented by someone else. Also, you should think about pressing charges if it escalates. The mailbox thing, that's property destruction, that's a crime." The sheriff didn't seem interested. "Then you hire a lawyer to push the sheriff. You make it official, you make it a record." They talked for an hour, and Sarah left feeling something that had been absent since the settlement. The feeling that she wasn't alone in her understanding of what had happened. The email came in early December, and it was the thing that made Sarah understand that James had been right, that paying Karen hadn't closed anything. It was from Karen's lawyer requesting communication about disturbing social media posts. When Sarah checked, she found that someone had started a Twitter account named Karen Ranch that was posting pictures of Karen's property and mocking her. The posts were mean. They were definitely bullying, and they were almost definitely not from Sarah. But Karen's lawyer was suggesting that they were. Patricia called within an hour of Sarah, forwarding her the email. "This is a problem," Patricia said. "She's trying to hold you liable for the online harassment. She's claiming that your statements to the media encouraged people to target her." "I signed a silence agreement." "And you haven't talked to the press since. But she's interpreting the existence of the online harassment as evidence that you set the tone, that your responsibility for the initial incident extended to responsible for the consequences." "That's insane." "Possibly, but it's the argument she's making, and the argument is being made by a lawyer, which means we need to take it seriously." Sarah hung up the phone and sat very still, understanding that she had made a fundamental miscalculation. She had thought paying Karen would end this. Instead, it had just changed the nature of the dispute. Now Karen could frame herself as the victim of Sarah's alleged encouragement of harassment, and she could use that to create legal liability where none had previously existed. That night she called James. "Come over," she said. "I need to talk to someone who actually understands how this works." He came over. He brought Thai food and a copy of the email from Karen's lawyer. They sat in Sarah's kitchen and he walked her through what would likely happen next. "She's positioning herself as a victim of ongoing harassment," James said, between bites of pad Thai. "She's trying to establish that the settlement didn't actually resolve anything, that the incident is ongoing, and that you bear responsibility for that. If she can establish responsibility, she can potentially open the settlement for renegotiation." "That's not possible." "Legally, it's complicated. But here's what I think is actually happening. She's not trying to win. She's trying to keep you engaged. She's trying to make sure you never get to stop dealing with her." Sarah put down her fork. Why would she want that? Because being the victim of a lawsuit is easier than being the person who caused the stampede, James said quietly. And also because you hurt her, you refused her, you set a boundary, and she's not someone who's good with boundaries. They worked late into the night, documenting everything. The original incident, the settlement, the new emails, the mailbox destruction, the calf on the property line. By the time James left, Sarah had a folder with everything she might need if this escalated further. You should file a complaint, James said at the door. File it formally with the Bar Association. It won't go anywhere immediate, but it creates a record that Corinne's lawyer is behaving unethically. That record matters. December in the valley brought fog that hung low and refused to lift. It was the kind of weather that made Sarah's property feel isolated, cut off from the world. The cattle huddled in groups for warmth. The landscape became gray and then grayer still, until visibility was measured in feet instead of miles. It was beautiful and melancholy, and exactly the kind of isolated that Sarah usually loved. This December, it just felt like a prison. The legal back and forth continued. Patricia sent stern letters. Corinne's lawyer sent back stern letters. The Bar Association acknowledged the complaint but said it would take months to investigate. Sarah's insurance company expressed frustration that the incident had somehow not been fully resolved. By December 15, Sarah had spent an additional $8,400 in legal fees trying to establish that she was not responsible for online harassment she hadn't created. She was beginning to understand that Corinne wasn't going to stop. This wasn't about compensation. This was about power. This was about Corinne having discovered that she could make Sarah's life harder just by continuing to exist in Sarah's proximity, by finding new angles and new grievances. James came over more frequently. They'd begun sleeping together in early December, not dramatically, just practically, and by the middle of the month, there was a toothbrush in Sarah's bathroom and clothes in her closet that belonged to him. Sarah didn't examine her feelings about this too closely. It was easier not to. It was easier to just let something happen that felt uncomplicated and good. You should document everything, James said one night, lying in bed with Sarah after they'd made love in a way that felt like tenderness disguised as urgency. Every contact from her lawyers, every threat, every piece of evidence that she's escalating, build a timeline, because eventually this is going to be something you take to court. I don't want to take her to court. I know, but she's not going to give you the choice. The only question is whether you're going to be prepared when it happens. On December 18, Sarah's veterinarian called with news that made her forget about Corinne for approximately 6 minutes. I have some results back from the blood work I did on your lead bull, Dr. Hayes said. I need to discuss them with you in person. Sarah's heart rate accelerated. What's wrong? Nothing terrible, but I'd rather explain in person. Can you come by the clinic tomorrow? Sarah spent the night researching cattle diseases and stress responses, and all the ways that the incident 3 months earlier could have had delayed consequences. She went to the clinic the next morning with the kind of tight stomach that comes from anticipating bad news. Dr. Hayes was waiting for her in the examination room, and she looked concerned in a way that suggested genuine worry rather than routine medical anxiety. Your bull is showing signs of arthritis, Dr. Hayes said without preamble. Significant arthritis, the kind that develops after a trauma to the joint. He's also got some ligament damage consistent with a hard impact. From the stampede. Possibly the timeline would be right. When cattle panic and move at speed, they can cause damage to themselves, joints, ligaments, muscles. I'm surprised more of your herd didn't show signs. This bull was probably pushing harder than the others, taking more impacts. Sarah thought of the lead bull, the massive Hereford who'd been first through the gate, first into the chaos. She thought of how he'd seemed fine in the days and weeks after, how she'd checked him daily for injuries, how he'd seemed undamaged. What happens now? She asked. We manage it. Pain medication, controlled movement, potentially some physical therapy. He's still young enough that the arthritis might progress slowly. But Sarah, this is permanent. This bull has a good life ahead of him, but he's not going to be what he was before. He's probably not valuable for breeding anymore. If you were going to use him for stock, I'd reconsider. The financial hit was immediate. Her lead bull, one of her most valuable animals, had been essentially crippled by the stampede and the subsequent panic. She'd been paid enough by the settlement to cover Corinne's damage, but nobody had paid her for this. She didn't tell Corinne. She didn't tell Patricia. She told James because he was there when she came home and found her sitting in the dark, understanding that the consequences of the stampede were going to follow her for years, that the damage had simply been distributed in ways she hadn't anticipated. "This is exactly why you need to document everything," James said quietly. "This is ongoing damage. Your bull is part of your business. The permanent injury to his value is directly traceable to that incident. It doesn't matter, she already paid me. She paid you for what she destroyed that night, not for the ongoing damage, not for the consequences that emerge later." Sarah didn't want to reopen the case. She wanted to move forward, but she was beginning to understand that forward wasn't actually available to her. The only way forward was through, and through meant acknowledging that every damage, every consequence, every ripple of that night belonged to her. The moment that changed everything came on December 22nd, 5 days before Christmas. Sarah was at the feed store restocking supplies when she ran into Robert Kelso, the man who'd driven through her fence. He was older than she'd realized from the police report, closer to 70 than 60. He was also, she understood immediately, genuinely remorseful in a way that Corinne had never managed. "Ms. Mitchell," he said when he recognized her, his face flushing. I've wanted to apologize for months. I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me, but I owe you an apology." Sarah was tired. She was tired of being angry at people. She was tired of carrying the weight of this incident. But she was also a person who believed in acknowledgement, in the idea that remorse mattered. "It's okay," she said, though it wasn't. "It's not," Robert said firmly. "What I did, driving through your fence, that was reckless and stupid. I was drunk, but that's not an excuse. I damaged your property, I damaged your cattle, and I've been lying awake thinking about it ever since. The sheriff said it was an accident. The sheriff said I claimed it was an accident because I was scared." Robert's voice was quiet but steady. "The truth is, I don't entirely remember. I remember the party. I remember trying to find the bathroom. I remember the impact. I don't remember intentionally driving through anything, but I also don't remember being careful. And I've been letting myself off the hook by claiming accident when the reality is, I was drunk and reckless and I caused damage. And maybe that's the same as an accident and maybe it's not, but I'm sorry either way." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition. Recognition that Robert Kelso was someone who could acknowledge his role, while Corinne Henderson was someone who could only ever see herself as the victim. "I'm sorry," Robert said again, "and if there's anything I can do—" "There is," Sarah said. "Don't come back to Corinne's parties, and if you see other people doing what you did, tell them to stop." Robert nodded. He looked like a weight had lifted slightly, not completely, but slightly. After he left, Sarah sat in her truck and cried for the first time since the settlement. By Christmas Eve, Sarah had made a decision. She called Patricia and told her what she wanted to do. "You want to file a new suit," Patricia said, clearly surprised. "For what? The settlement is binding, you can't go back." "Not against Corinne," Sarah said. "I want to file against Robert Kelso's homeowner's insurance. I want to claim damages for the ongoing injury to the bull. I want to document every piece of medical care, every lost income, every ongoing consequence of his actions." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "This is going to be complicated. He has insurance, but the claim has already been settled through Corinne's property damage claim. You might be trying to double dip." "I'm not asking for the same damage. I'm asking for specific damages related to ongoing medical treatment for an animal that was injured by his negligent behavior. You understand this is essentially admitting that you want to continue this fight. I understand that I've been trying to pretend this is over when it's not. It's not over. I have an animal who will need pain management for the rest of his life because of what happened. Someone needs to account for that." Patricia sighed, but there was a note in her sigh that suggested respect. "Okay, I'll look into it. But Sarah, I want you to understand what you're doing. You're choosing to re-engage. You're choosing to make this your identity. You're choosing to let this incident define the next year or more of your life." "I already am," Sarah said. "At least this way I'm choosing it deliberately." New Year's Eve came, and Sarah spent it with James at a quiet bar in the next town over, nowhere near anyone who might know her. They toasted to the new year, and James raised his glass one more time. "To recognizing what's yours," he said, "and what isn't." Sarah drank to that. understanding it was both more complicated and simpler than it sounded. Patricia's first legal move came in early January. By late January, the insurance company was taking the claim seriously. By February, they'd made an offer, $6,500, covering a year of medical care and pain management for the bull. Sarah negotiated. She asked for $12,000, covering 3 years of anticipated care. The insurance company countered at $8,000. Sarah accepted $9,200, which represented approximately the amount she expected to spend on the bull's care over the next 2 years, assuming his condition didn't deteriorate further. The settlement came through in March, without fanfare, without news coverage, without any public acknowledgement that Sarah had won anything. She'd won the acknowledgement that Robert Kelso's actions had consequences that extended beyond a single evening. She'd won the recognition that damage wasn't abstract. She'd won the principle that someone was responsible. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The thing nobody talks about, Sarah learned, is that being right doesn't actually make you happy. Being vindicated doesn't heal anything. Having someone admit their responsibility doesn't undo the damage. What it does is give you the legal and moral standing to stop carrying the weight of it alone. Corinne disappeared from Sarah's life in May, when Corinne's house sold to a young family from Sacramento who had no idea about the stampede and who seemed genuinely delighted with the property. Sarah only learned about it from Diane, who'd heard at the grocery store. She didn't feel happy or sad about it. She just felt a kind of flatness, the way you feel after someone who's taken up space in your mind for months just stops existing in your vicinity. James moved into the ranch in June, into the small guest house that Sarah had spent the previous month cleaning and renovating. It was obvious to everyone in the community, and by August, it was common knowledge that Sarah Mitchell was dating the lawyer who'd helped her fight Corinne Henderson. The narrative shifted slightly. Now Sarah was the woman who'd found happiness after the tragedy, which was a different kind of story than the one that had circulated before. Sarah's bull lived another 3 years, comfortable and content despite the arthritis. He never fully recovered his value as breeding stock, but he became a favorite of visitors, a gentle giant who seemed to understand that his body had limits and accepted that gracefully. The cattle continued. The ranch continued. Life, with its particular mixture of hardship and beauty and the constant, grinding necessity of continuation, moved forward. On the anniversary of the party, Sarah was working fence in the eastern pasture, the one that bordered where Corinne's property used to be, when James came out with sandwiches and cold drinks. They sat under the trees, and Sarah didn't think about Corinne or the stampede or any of it. She just existed in the moment, in the shade, with someone who'd chosen to stay. That, she understood finally, was what victory actually looked like. Not the legal wins, not the settlements, not the vindication. Just the quiet return to your own life, lived on your own terms, no longer disrupted by someone else's need for chaos. The news came through Patricia's office on a Tuesday in October, exactly 2 years and 3 months after the pool party. Corinne Henderson had filed for bankruptcy. The details emerged slowly: the settlement with Sarah, the subsequent damage assessments, the legal fees from 3 different lawsuits. Corinne had also apparently made some poor investments and had ongoing alimony payments to her ex-husband. The combination had added up to a financial situation that she couldn't recover from. Her new house, purchased for approximately $850,003 years earlier, was being sold in a short sale. She was moving back to the Bay Area to live with her sister. The life she'd constructed in the valley was being dismantled piece by piece. Sarah read the details and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, just the acknowledgement that consequences worked on their own timeline in their own way, and that sometimes karma was just mathematics catching up with choices. James found her reading the news article on her phone. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," Sarah said, and meant it. "I actually am." Even though what? Even though she got what she deserved? I don't know if she deserves anything. I just know that her choices led here, and now she's dealing with it, and I'm not her problem anymore. That was the real victory, Sarah thought. Not that Corinne had suffered, but that Sarah had gotten to a place where Corinne's suffering was just something that happened, not something Sarah was responsible for, not something that mattered to her life anymore. She closed her phone and went back to work. There were cattle to check, a fence section that needed repair, and the evening feeding that waited for no one. The work was endless and necessary and filled with its own kind of meaning. The ranch continued. Life continued. And Sarah Mitchell, 44 years old, with a partner who loved her and cattle that trusted her, and a life that was hers and only hers, moved forward into whatever came next. Sometimes that's the ending. Not the dramatic moment of triumph, but the quiet recognition that you've already won, and now you just get to live.